Have you ever been in a relationship where, on the surface, there is no conflict, no arguments, no obvious hurt, yet the longer you stay, the more you feel uncomfortable being yourself? A feeling that is very vague, hard to name, not strong enough to make you leave, but persistent enough to keep you constantly on guard. Maybe it is a comment that sounds like a joke but leaves you hurt, a kind of concern that makes you feel controlled rather than loved, a joy you do not dare to fully share, for fear of making someone uncomfortable. And the most confusing part is this: that person is someone you are very close to and deeply trust. Carl Jung believed that human beings do not live only by what they are consciously aware of, but are also powerfully influenced by the unacknowledged shadow within each person. When that shadow is not faced, it seeps into relationships, not through open hatred, but through subtle behaviors that are difficult to recognize. In this video, we will look directly at those silent signs, not to accuse anyone, but to help you understand more clearly what is really happening, and more importantly, to understand yourself more deeply. And stay until the very last sign, because it is one that many people overlook, yet it reveals the truth more clearly than any words ever could. Sign 1. Disguised sarcasm. Contempt rarely appears in the form of open hostility. It often hides itself in laughter. This sentence may sound gentle at first, but if you have ever been in a relationship where, after every moment of laughing it off, your heart sinks just a little, then you understand there are smiles that carry no joy. They carry a different message, more subtle, harder to name, and far more difficult to resist. Because you cannot get angry at a joke, and you cannot easily accuse someone just because they were only kidding. Redder 42. Disguised sarcasm is one of the earliest and most common signs of suppressed hostility in close relationships. It does not arrive with shouting or obvious conflict. It comes quietly, at precisely the right moment, and often targets the most sensitive parts of you. It may be your appearance, the path you are choosing, the confidence you have only recently rebuilt after a period of collapse, or the quiet efforts that few people ever see. And what is striking is this: the person saying these things often knows exactly where they are touching. Comments like, "You seem pretty confident these days, so this counts as success now?" Or, "Funny how people like you are into psychology books lately," are usually delivered in a light tone, accompanied by a smile, sometimes even a friendly pat on the shoulder. If someone else were present, they would likely see it as a playful moment between close acquaintances, but only you feel what lingers after the laughter fades, a very small discomfort, but persistent, a hint of awkwardness, a fleeting doubt. Am I overreacting? And so, you choose silence, not because you feel nothing, but because what you feel does not seem big enough to speak up about. It does not resemble a clear insult. It feels more like a fine scratch, repeated over and over in the same place. The more it happens, the more you shrink. You share less. You laugh less. You start thinking carefully before mentioning a new plan, a new joy, or something you feel proud of. Not because those things no longer exist, but because you fear they will once again become material for another joke. What makes this kind of sarcasm particularly dangerous is that it is always accompanied by a denial of your emotional experience. When you show discomfort, the familiar response is often, "Oh, come on, I was just joking," or worse, "You're too sensitive." At that point, it is not only your feelings that are being touched, but your right to feel at all that is being dismissed. You begin to doubt your own reactions. You ask yourself, maybe I really am too sensitive. And that is when your inner boundaries start to blur. Carl Jung once wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." This line offers an important key to understanding why disguised sarcasm appears so frequently, especially from those closest to us. When someone carries feelings of inferiority, envy, or dissatisfaction with their own life, but lacks the courage to face them directly, they need an outlet. And one of the least risky ways to release that tension is to project those feelings outward onto someone else. In the mechanism of projection, what a person cannot accept in themselves is seen in others. Someone who lacks confidence may feel irritated by your confidence. Someone who has not dared to pursue their dreams may look down on your passion. Someone who feels stuck may mock your progress not because you are doing something wrong, but because your presence forces them to confront what they are avoiding within themselves. And in this case, sarcasm becomes the perfect tool. It releases emotion while preserving a facade of niceness. Consider a situation that feels very familiar. You share with a close person that you are nurturing a new plan. Regardless of whether it succeeds, the fact that you dare to think about it and speak it aloud is already a step forward. They listen, smile slightly, and say, "Sounds ambitious, hopefully you won't quit halfway like last time." The sentence ends with laughter. Yet in that moment, you feel pulled backward, and a better pulled our clo. The another weather pulled our clo, and a better clow. One seven research, and a better poured our. We have all. Not because they mentioned the past, but because of the way they did it, making your present effort feel fragile and suspect. If this happens once, you might brush it aside. But if you begin to notice a pattern every time you step out of your comfort zone, every time you show confidence, every time you talk about something meaningful to you, that person responds with a similar joke, then this is no longer coincidence. It is a repeated behavior, driven at an unconscious level, and it carries a very clear message. Don't rise too much. Don't change too much. What is important to note is that the person engaging in this behavior is often unaware of what they are doing. In their mind, they are simply being humorous, straightforward, or even telling you the truth. They do not believe they are hurting you. But Jung emphasized that it is precisely unconscious behaviors that shape our deepest relationships. When the shadow is not recognized, it governs how we interact with others, whether we are aware of it or not. On your side, the feelings that arise after these jokes are crucial clues. The sense of becoming smaller, the urge to censor yourself, the feeling that it is no longer safe to be fully yourself. These sensations do not come from nowhere. They are natural responses of the nervous system, recognizing a subtle form of disrespect. Feeling this way does not mean you are weak. It means you are perceptive enough to sense that something is off. Perhaps you have found yourself asking, after conversations like this, "Am I too sensitive?" This question appears frequently for those experiencing disguised sarcasm. Because the sarcasm is wrapped in familiarity, it becomes difficult to distinguish between harmless teasing and a deliberately aimed arrow. But if you have to ask this question repeatedly, if self-doubt consistently follows interactions with the same person, then that question itself is already an answer. The solution here does not lie in immediate confrontation or exposing the other person. Direct confrontation is often ineffective with covert behaviors because they always leave room for denial. What matters more is observation. Notice the frequency. Pay attention to whether the jokes repeat and whether they consistently target the same area. Listen to how you feel after each interaction, rather than focusing solely on the other person's explanations. You also do not need to immediately establish boundaries through words if you are not ready. Sometimes boundaries begin internally, by no longer forcing a strained laugh, by no longer sharing your most vulnerable parts with someone who turns them into jokes, by trusting that your feelings have value, even when others try to dismiss them. Self-respect is not something you prove through dramatic reactions. It begins when you allow yourself to trust your inner experience. When you stop convincing yourself that they probably didn't mean anything while your body is tightening inside, you are choosing to stand on the side of your true self, and that choice matters. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Becoming yourself is not only about daring to pursue big dreams, it is also about respecting the smallest inner signals. Signals that tell you where you are supported and where you are being quietly worn down. When you begin to recognize disguised sarcasm in close relationships, you do not need to become harsh or bitter. You only need to be honest enough to stop making yourself smaller. Because genuine respect never needs to hide behind laughter, and a healthy relationship will never require you to doubt your right to feel. Sign 2. Covert sabotage. Have you ever fallen into this feeling? No one openly opposes you. No one tells you, don't do it. Yet somehow, every step forward you try to take keeps slowing down in a way you cannot quite explain. The important things in your life rarely collapse outright. They are simply delayed a little, thrown off by a small detail, or missing just the one piece of information you needed. And strangely enough, this keeps happening only when you rely on help from certain people. At first glance, this phenomenon is very hard to name. It does not feel like betrayal. It does not look like open resistance. Everything is light enough for you to convince yourself that it is just bad luck, a misunderstanding, or circumstances beyond anyone's control. But when you look more closely, a familiar feeling begins to surface. Every time you are about to move one step forward, something small, but significant enough, slows you down. And oddly, it is often connected to the same person you trust. Covert sabotage does not knock you down immediately. It makes you hesitate. It does not strike you directly. It strikes your momentum. And because of that, it is harder to recognize than almost any other form of hostility. There are no harsh words for you to react to, no obvious actions to confront, only a chain of reasonable mistakes that gradually leads you to doubt yourself. You begin to notice things like deadlines being mentioned incorrectly, advice offered at a critical moment that pushes you toward a disadvantageous choice, important information being forgotten until it is already too late. When you ask about it, the other person always has a perfectly reasonable explanation. They were too busy and forgot. They thought you already knew. Or they simply didn't think it was that important. And because each incident is just a small detail, it is hard for you to get angry. It is also hard to accuse anyone, because logically, no one seems to have done anything wrong. But your emotional experience tells a different story. After each incident, you do not only feel regret over a missed opportunity, you feel confused. You start asking yourself, was I not careful enough? Am I overreacting? Is my ability really not good enough? Covert sabotage does not only ruin a plan, it erodes your trust in your own competence. What makes this especially dangerous is that this kind of behavior often comes from people who are very close to you. Longtime friends, trusted colleagues, family members, or those who constantly say they are here for you. That closeness makes suspicion even harder. You do not want to believe that someone you care about could be a source of obstruction, so you rationalize, continue to place your trust, and continue to slow down. Carl Jung once wrote, "When an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside as fate." This sentence captures the essence of covert sabotage with striking accuracy. When a person carries unacknowledged frustration, resentment, or feelings of inferiority, they do not necessarily express it through direct attacks. That shadow finds another way to exist, and sometimes that way is interfering with another person's path, unconsciously. In many cases, the person engaging in covert sabotage is not aware of what they are doing. In their own mind, they still see themselves as kind, still believe they are being helpful. But at a deeper level, your progress stirs discomfort they do not dare to name. Each step you take forward becomes a reminder that they are standing still, or that they missed something in their own life. And instead of facing that feeling, they unconsciously try to slow you down just a little, just enough to make themselves feel more at ease. Imagine a very ordinary situation. You are preparing for an important interview. A close friend, who knows your schedule well, promises to send you information about the interviewer or the meeting content. As the time approaches, they message you, "Oh, I forgot, we'll send it tomorrow." Tomorrow comes, and the interview is already over. You do not blame them. You blame yourself for not being more proactive. But when you look back, you realize this is not the first time. Previously, the same person also forgot something important right when you needed it. Or in a work environment, you are assigned to lead a project. A close colleague who holds key information says nothing until the deadline is only a few hours away. When you ask, they respond casually, "Oh, I thought everyone already knew this." The result is a missed deadline. You are evaluated as lacking initiative, and they are never mentioned, because formally, they did nothing wrong. If this happens only once, you might consider it an accident. But if you begin to see a pattern, a series of similar accidents revolving around the same person, this is the moment to pause and observe. Covert sabotage is rarely a single strike. It is a sequence of small, repeated actions, enough to throw you off course without triggering any confrontation. You might ask yourself, do these disruptions keep happening around the same person? This question is crucial because it helps separate emotion from fact, not to accuse anyone, but to clearly see the pattern that is unfolding. That pattern will tell you more than any explanation ever could. What traps many people in this kind of relationship is guilt about suspicion. You fear becoming paranoid, fear overreacting, fear losing a relationship. But what you forget is that unease does not appear without reason. It arises when there is inconsistency between words and real-world impact. Someone may say they support you, but if the result of that support repeatedly costs you opportunities, it is time to trust your lived experience more than their reassurance. The solution here is not aggressive confrontation or exposure. Covert sabotage is difficult to address through confrontation because it always has a reasonable cover. Instead, what matters is reducing dependence. Keep important matters within your own control. Do not hand over full trust and responsibility to someone who has repeatedly disrupted your momentum, no matter how close they are. Reducing dependence does not mean becoming cold or selfish. It is simply a form of self-protection. You can still be kind, but no longer naive. You can maintain the relationship, but you stop placing the critical parts of your life in the hands of someone who has not proven reliability. Boundaries here are not walls. They are a distance just wide enough to prevent you from continuing to hurt yourself. You may come to a difficult realization. Not everyone who says they want you to succeed can truly tolerate your success. Some people are only comfortable when you are beside them or slightly beneath them. When you start moving faster, their shadow is activated, and instead of being honest about that discomfort, they choose to slow you down, gently, subtly, skillfully. You do not need to be angry with them. You do not need to explain yourself to them. What matters more is that you understand what is happening and that you choose to protect your pace. When you stop allowing small mistakes to repeatedly dictate your path, you send a clear message to yourself. This path matters enough for me to take full responsibility for it. Boundaries are not coldness. Boundaries are the point at which you stop handing control of your life to people who cannot or will not support you fully. And when you do this, one thing becomes clear. Your progress is no longer obstructed by vague forces. You begin to move more steadily, not because the world suddenly becomes easier, but because you have chosen to stand on your own side. If you are listening to this and see yourself in these situations, pause for a moment, not to judge anyone, but to ask yourself, am I moving slowly because of circumstances or because I am placing my trust in the wrong place? The answer, however uncomfortable, will be the first step toward reclaiming your true rhythm forward. Sign 3. Silent competition. You share a piece of good news. The room falls quiet for a few seconds. Then the other person nods and begins talking about their own achievements, bigger, longer, and completely unrelated. The moment is brief, but if you have experienced it, you will remember very clearly the feeling that follows. Not anger, not obvious hurt, but a slight inner hesitation, as if your joy has just been placed in the wrong spot. You still smile, you still listen to their story, yet inside, something has been pulled slightly off center, and you are no longer sure whether you should keep talking. Silent competition rarely reveals itself through confrontation. It does not need arguments. It does not require open rivalry. It appears polite, appropriate, even dressed up as an ordinary conversation. But if you pay attention, a familiar pattern emerges. Every time you share an achievement, a step forward, or simply something that makes you proud, your joy is quickly redirected. No one denies you outright. They simply place themselves at the center in a more subtle way. You talk about finishing a difficult project, they nod and say, "Yeah, that's fine. Back then when I did something similar, it was much more stressful." You mention being recognized at work, They smile and recount a time when they received even greater praise. You share a personal moment of happiness. They listen for a few seconds and then shift to their own story, as if your joy were merely the introduction to what they truly want to say. At first, you may not think much of it. You tell yourself that everyone has their own story, but gradually, something feels off. You begin to hesitate before sharing. You adjust how you tell things, making them shorter, lighter. You add phrases like, "It's really nothing," or "It was probably just luck," as a way of asking permission to be happy without making anyone uncomfortable. And then you realize that you are shrinking your own joy. What makes silent competition so uncomfortable is not whether the other person has achievements or not. It is the feeling of being pulled into a comparison you never signed up for. You are not bragging. You are simply telling the truth. Yet their response makes you feel as though you have crossed an invisible boundary, one you did not even know existed until you touched it. Carl Jung once wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." Although this statement was framed in the context of family, its spirit reaches the core of silent competition in all relationships. When someone has not lived the life they wanted, has not achieved what they once longed for, another person's success becomes more than good news. It turns into a mirror reflecting the empty spaces they are trying to avoid. In Jungian psychology, an inferiority complex does not always show up as obvious self-doubt. Sometimes it disguises itself as mild rivalry, as just comparing for fun, as the constant need to place one's own achievements next to someone else's. Not to openly diminish you, but to reassure themselves that they are still okay, still not behind, still not left out. Imagine a very ordinary situation. You receive a new opportunity and excitedly tell a close friend. They listen, nod, and say, "Yeah, that's good, but I used to do even better than that." The sentence does not deny you, but it does something more dangerous. It pushes your joy into a secondary position. Suddenly, you feel as if you have said something at the wrong time, to the wrong person. If this happens once, you might brush it off. But if you notice that every time you share something positive, the other person always has a bigger story to tell, a higher achievement to place on the table, then it is no longer random. It is a form of competition without words, where they need to reaffirm their position every time you step up to a new level. What is worth noting is that people engaged in silent competition rarely realize they are doing it. In their mind, they are simply sharing experiences, telling life stories, or giving you the bigger picture. But, at a deeper level, this behavior comes from unresolved insecurity. Your success touches that vulnerable point, and their automatic response is to pull the attention back to themselves. For you, the consequence is not just a fleeting sense of disappointment. Over time, you begin to self-censor your emotions. You choose silence instead of continuing to share. You hide the things that make you happy, not because you are humble, but because you are tired of adjusting your joy to fit someone else's emotional comfort. And so a strange paradox appears. You begin to feel guilty for doing well. Have you ever shrunk your joy to make others feel more comfortable? Have you ever stopped mid-story and thought, "That's probably enough"? Have you ever felt the need to soften your own success just to avoid triggering an unspoken comparison? If the answer is yes, you may be in a relationship marked by silent competition. The solution here is not about proving yourself or winning. You do not need to win a competition you never wanted to join. What matters more is choosing the right people to share with. Not everyone is safe enough to receive your joy, and that says nothing about your worth. It speaks to their capacity to face themselves. Choosing the right people to share with does not mean hiding your light. On the contrary, it allows you to keep that light intact. You can continue to celebrate, continue to feel proud, continue to tell your story with people who do not need to compare themselves every time they listen to you. People who can receive your joy without feeling threatened. And for the remaining relationships, where you always feel the need to be considerate when you are happy, creating a small emotional distance is entirely reasonable. Not to punish anyone, but to stop hurting yourself. You do not need to cut ties or confront. Sometimes, the simplest choice is to stop sharing what matters most with those who cannot receive it in a healthy way. True joy does not need permission. It does not need to be minimized, explained, or measured against anyone else to be valid. When you allow yourself to be fully joyful without apologizing, without shrinking, you are doing something deeply important. You are standing on the side of your true self. And if someone feels uncomfortable with that, it is their inner work, not your responsibility. You were not born to fit inside someone else's insecurity. You were born to move at your own pace and to share your joy where it is welcomed, not weighed against someone else's measure. Sign 4. Politeness disguised as distance. Carl Jung once warned that coldness does not always come from malice, but often from emotions that have been detached from consciousness for far too long. Hearing this statement, you might not immediately think of anyone in particular, but if you let it settle for a moment, a familiar face may appear, not someone who hurt you directly, not someone who spoke harsh words or showed open hostility, but someone who is always proper, always polite, always knows the right things to say, yet is absent precisely at the moments when you need them most. Politeness, disguised as distance, is one of the hardest signs to recognize, because on the surface, it carries no obvious negativity. No one can blame them, because they have done nothing wrong. They check in. They congratulate you. They reply to messages. They are not rude. But if you are honest with yourself, you will sense that something is missing. Not words, but genuine presence. You may tell them about a major upheaval in your life, a fall, a loss, a period when you were nearly exhausted. They respond with familiar phrases. Hang in there. Everything will be okay. I believe you can get through this. These words sound perfectly reasonable. But then, what happens next? No follow-up message. No phone call. No return. The relationship simply moves on, as if nothing significant had just occurred. And that is what confuses you. You cannot say they are indifferent, because they did respond. You cannot say they abandoned you, because they are still there, at least in name. Yet the loneliness is real, a particular kind of loneliness that appears even while the relationship still exists. Polite distance does not hurt like a direct blow. It erodes more slowly. It makes you wonder, am I asking for too much? Is everyone like this? Am I being too sensitive? Also, and in that process, you begin to lower your own emotional needs just to fit the level of presence that the other person can or wants to offer. Carl Jung once wrote, "Where love stops, power begins, and violence, and terror." This statement is not only about power or violence in a physical sense. It also touches on a more subtle form of power in relationships, the power of emotional withdrawal. When someone no longer connects through genuine emotion but maintains polite social form, they create a safe distance for themselves while the other person bears the emptiness. In Jungian terms, this is a form of emotional detachment. Not everyone does this because they are cruel. Many do it because they do not know how to stay with another person's emotions. They fear vulnerability. They fear moments that require real presence. They fear touching pain, because doing so might force them to face parts of themselves that remain unhealed. So they choose politeness. Politeness is the perfect armor. It allows them to appear proper. It protects them from being judged as uncaring. And most importantly, it keeps them from going deeper, from staying longer, from carrying any emotional weight. Think back for a moment. How many times have you felt unable to say more to this person, even though they never explicitly rejected you? How many times did you stop mid-story because you sensed that their presence was not safe enough for you to fully open up? How many times did you say, "I'm fine," just to move on quickly, knowing that if you spoke honestly, you would only receive generic responses anyway? Politeness, disguised as distance, makes you feel as though you are asking the wrong person, not because you are too much, but because the other person can only meet you at a very shallow level. Yet instead of acknowledging that limitation, they keep everything on the surface. And if you are not careful, you will be the one sinking deeper alone. The real danger here is not that they are not there for you. It is that you begin to get used to not being supported. You learn to endure on your own. You learn not to bother anyone. And gradually, You confuse healthy independence with emotional isolation. You pride yourself on being strong. But deep inside, a part of you is very tired. Do you feel lonely even though the relationship still exists? This question is not meant to accuse anyone. It simply invites you to look honestly at your own experience, because that feeling does not arise without reason. It is a signal, and if you ignore it for too long, you may begin to doubt your own need for connection. The solution here is not confrontation or exposure. You do not need to say, "You don't care about me enough." That rarely leads anywhere, especially with people who are accustomed to detaching from emotion. Instead, a more practical solution is to adjust the level of sharing, not as punishment, but as self-protection. If someone cannot support your vulnerable parts, stop placing them in that person's hands. This does not make you weak. It makes you wiser. You have the right to choose where you place your emotions. You have the right to choose who is allowed into the important moments of your life. Reducing what you share does not mean cutting ties. It simply means stopping misplaced expectations. You can remain polite. You can keep the relationship at a social level. But you no longer wait for warmth where there is only correctness. And that is what helps you stop feeling disappointed. True closeness is not measured by the number of messages or eloquent words. It is measured by presence at the right time. Someone who truly cares may not say much, but they will be there when you need them. They will not disappear after a few polite phrases. They will not leave you alone with your pain and call it respecting your space. When you begin to distinguish between politeness and genuine closeness, you are doing something very important for yourself. You are restoring each relationship to its proper place. And you are stopping the habit of forcing yourself to feel supported in spaces that cannot or do not want to support you. It is important to be clear. This sign is not meant to make you suspicious of everyone. It simply invites you to be more honest with your own experience. If a relationship consistently leaves you feeling empty after you share, then, no matter how polite it appears, it is not a place to lay your heart. And pulling some of your emotional investment back from it is not a loss. It is an act of self-respect. Now that you have come this far, I want to pause for a moment to thank you for truly listening, not just with your ears, but with your own deeply personal experiences. If what you have just heard made you nod or brought to mind a relationship in your life, consider sharing this video with someone you believe might need it too. A like or a share not only helps this message reach more people, but also gives you permission to pause, breathe, and reorganize your emotions. And now, we will move on together to sign number 5, where care begins to take the shape of control, more subtle, more intimate, and far harder to recognize. Sign 5, control, disguised as care. Any form of concern that gradually strips you of your right to self-determination is not love, but control in disguise. If you sit with this sentence long enough, an uncomfortable truth begins to surface. Many behaviors labeled as care in real life do not make you safer, they make you smaller. Not immediately. Not through commands, but through words that sound reasonable, logical, and supposedly for your own good. And precisely because of that, this form of hostility is harder to recognize than any other. Control disguised as care rarely shows up as blatant force. It arrives gently, little by little. At first, it is advice, then questions, then raised eyebrows, silences, and the phrase, "I'm just worried about you," repeated often enough that you begin to doubt yourself. And before you realize it, you are no longer living by your own intuition, but by constantly weighing what the other person might think. Look at the behavior. This person always has opinions about your decisions, even when you did not ask. They question your choices under the guise of just making sure. They comment on how you work, how you love, how you spend money, how you live. Nothing sounds malicious. Everything is wrapped in concern. But what matters is the frequency and how you feel afterward. After talking to them, do you feel clearer or more hesitant? Do you feel reinforced, or do you feel the need to double-check every decision, every feeling, every inner impulse? Subtle control does not make you resist right away. It slows you down. It casts a fog of doubt thick enough that you begin censoring yourself. The emotional experience of someone in this kind of relationship is very specific. You are not explosively angry. You do not feel clearly insulted. You just feel tired. Tired of explaining. Tired of justifying. Tired of every decision being followed by an inner dialogue. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm not mature enough yet. And gradually, you lose something vital. Trust in your own intuition. Carl Jung once wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls." When someone cannot tolerate their own inner chaos, they try to organize the external world. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to control others, especially those closest to them. In Jungian terms, this is not a moral issue but a psychological one. A person overwhelmed by inner instability, fear of failure, fear of losing control, fear of being left behind, often has no awareness of it. They do not say, "I am anxious, so I need to control you." Instead, they say, "I care about you," and they genuinely believe it. But true care does not take away your autonomy. It does not make you ask permission to live your own life. It does not make you feel guilty for choosing differently. Control disguised as care does the opposite. It makes you feel as though you must constantly adjust yourself to avoid upsetting the other person, and that is a very clear sign. Notice a small but important detail. When you follow their advice, everything is calm. When you do not, there is no major argument, but there is a shift, silence, disappointment, indirect remarks. And if you are used to keeping the peace, you will begin adjusting your behavior to avoid those feelings. This is how control works most effectively. No force required, only self-adjustment. A familiar example, you share a new plan. They listen and say, "I'm just worried about you, but I think you should listen to me." It sounds reasonable. But if you look closely, the statement does not open choices, it closes them. It subtly places their judgment above your intuition. And repeated often enough, you begin to believe they know your life better than you do. Do you notice whether you are living by your intuition or by their expectations? This question is not meant to accuse yourself. It is meant to help you observe. Because control disguised as care is rarely identified through logic, it is felt in the body. You become more tense, more guarded, less comfortable speaking honestly, and that is a sign that something is crossing your inner boundaries. Jung also said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Someone who cannot accept uncertainty within themselves will struggle to accept independence in others. Your freedom does not inspire them, it unsettles them. And rather than face that discomfort, they try to make you smaller, slower, more predictable. The danger is that you may mistake this control for genuine care, especially if you grew up in an environment where love always came with conditions. You learned that you are loved when you comply, accepted when you meet expectations. So when someone controls you through concern, it feels familiar, and that familiarity makes it hard to leave. The solution here is not cutting ties or aggressive confrontation. Direct confrontation often only activates the other person's need for control. A more practical and more powerful solution is boundaries. Boundaries do not mean over-explaining. In fact, the clearer the boundary, the less explanation is needed. You do not have to justify every decision. You do not have to convince anyone that you know what you are doing. You simply stop opening yourself too deeply to those who constantly question your intuition. You keep part of your inner life for yourself. You choose carefully what you share, and you observe how they react when you no longer seek their approval. At first, this may bring guilt. Especially if you are used to pleasing others, boundaries can feel selfish. But in truth, they are the first step toward maturity. You are not taking anything away from anyone. Love does not strip you of autonomy. It does not require you to shrink to fit someone else's insecurity. It does not ask you to silence your inner voice, to keep the peace. If a relationship only functions when you comply, it is not a place for growth. Recognizing this does not make you cold, it makes you conscious. Before moving on, one thing needs to be clear. This sign is not meant to condemn anyone. It is meant to help you see more clearly what is happening in your closest relationships. If someone's care consistently comes at the cost of your self-determination, then no matter what it is called, it is not healthy love. And choosing to protect your intuition, your boundaries, and your autonomy is not a betrayal of the relationship. It is a return to your true self. Sign 6. Talking behind your back. Have you ever felt your reputation quietly shifting, sensed through the way others now look at you with more caution? Conversations that once flowed openly suddenly become shorter. A few gatherings within a group you were once close to are no longer mentioned to you, and you begin to feel slightly out of place within a familiar circle, even though you cannot pinpoint when that distance first appeared. The most uncomfortable moment is not when you are confronted directly, but when you are never given the chance to speak for yourself. You do not know what has been said. You do not know how the story has been distorted. You only feel the outcome, a quiet misunderstanding spreading slowly but steadily, like a cold mist settling over relationships that were once perfectly normal. Talking behind someone's back rarely appears in a crude form. It is often wrapped in the language of concern. Someone shares your private story with others under the excuse of worrying about you, or phrases like, "I didn't want to tell you, but lately they seem a bit off," or "maybe they're stressed. That's why they're acting strange." These statements do not sound malicious. They can even sound considerate, and it is precisely this false kindness that makes them hardest to defend against. Because how do you argue with something labeled as concern? And so, while you continue behaving normally, showing up, talking as usual, somewhere else, a different version of you is being told. A version that seems more unstable, more distant, even more troubling. You are not there. You have no right to correct the story, yet you are its main character. The emotional experience of being in this situation is very specific. You begin asking yourself, what did I do wrong? What? You replay every conversation, every message, every meeting, trying to find the moment you may have unintentionally hurt someone. But there is no clear answer. Only a vague sense that you are being judged based on something you never actually said. Carl Jung wrote, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. When someone lacks the courage to face their own negative emotions, envy, resentment, a sense of inferiority, they look for ways to project them outward. And the easiest way to do that, without taking direct responsibility, is through stories about someone else." Gossip, from a Jungian perspective, is not merely a social habit. It is a psychological release valve. When a group shares discomfort together, they create a sense of bonding by identifying a problem in someone who is absent. Individual shadow becomes diluted into collective shadow, and the person being talked about becomes the container for everything the group does not want to acknowledge in themselves. What is striking is that those who talk behind your back rarely see themselves as doing something wrong. In their own minds, they are warning, protecting, or sharing concern. That is precisely why they do not feel the need to speak to you directly. Direct dialogue would force them to face their own emotions. Talking behind your back does not. Imagine a very ordinary situation. You are going through a difficult phase. You speak less, withdraw slightly. You share this with a close friend. They nod, listen, appear understanding. But later, they retell your story to others with a carefully adjusted tone. "They've been a bit unstable lately. I think they're having emotional issues." The story is not entirely false, but it is no longer your story. It has become a label. And then, those who hear it begin to look at you differently. No one asks if you are okay. No one initiates a real conversation. They simply keep their distance, because they have heard that you are not okay. You become isolated not because of your actions, but because of a retold version of you. Have you ever experienced that feeling? Walking into a room and sensing that the atmosphere has changed? Conversations that once flowed freely, now stopping midway? Feeling the urge to explain, but not knowing what you are supposed to explain, or to whom? A seemingly harmless sentence like, "I just think they've been a bit unbalanced lately," can be enough to cause deep harm. Because it does not merely comment on your current state, it quietly undermines your credibility in the eyes of others. And you may never even know it happened. Carl Jung observed, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. For many, admitting that they feel jealous, uncomfortable, or threatened by you is too painful. Talking behind your back becomes a far safer detour. The greatest danger of this behavior is not the words themselves, but the erosion they cause. You begin to doubt yourself. You censor your speech. You become cautious about sharing. And gradually, you shrink not because you want to, but because the environment no longer feels safe. So what should you do when you recognize this sign? The most natural impulse is to defend yourself, to explain, to clarify. But in most cases, rushing to justify yourself only places you in a defensive position. You are trying to fix a story whose source you do not control. Instead, the first step is observation. Observe where the shift began, with one specific person or a group. Who tends to relay information? Who knows the most about your private life but avoids direct conversation when issues arise? These questions are not meant to accuse, but to help you understand the context. The next step is to withdraw access. Not everyone who knows your story deserves to hear it. Closeness is not measured by how long you have known someone, but by emotional safety. If someone has used your vulnerability as material for conversations with others, it is entirely reasonable to keep certain parts of yourself private. Have you noticed that people who talk behind your back are often very curious about your inner life? They ask many questions. They seem attentive. But that attention does not come with responsibility, and that is the boundary you need to establish. Finally, remember this: truth does not need noise to exist. You do not have to go everywhere trying to correct your image. Those who truly want to understand you will come to you. Those who only believe the retold version may never have genuinely wanted to connect with you in the first place. Carl Jung said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." When you become conscious enough to realize that you cannot control how others speak about you, you stop trying to. You return to the only thing you can do: live honestly, live clearly, and live in alignment with yourself. If you are in this situation, ask yourself, where did the change in how others treat you begin? And more importantly, are you trying to protect an image? Or are you protecting your truth? Because sometimes, silence is not weakness. It is a conscious choice. And stepping back from relationships that no longer feel safe is not a loss. It is a profound form of self-respect. In the end, truth will find a way to stand, without you needing to shout, without you needing to prove anything. It lives in how you show up, in your consistency, and in relationships healthy enough to see you, not merely hear stories about you. Sign 7. Betrayal through body language. You talk about something that makes you proud, not bragging, just a very human moment you tried, and you finally succeeded. The other person smiles. A very quick smile. Their eyes glance away for a split second. Their voice follows. "Yeah, congratulations." Not raised. Not cold. Yet when that moment passes, what lingers inside you is not joy, but a vague chill, as if something has just fallen out of sync. If you have ever experienced this feeling, you know how hard it is to name. No words were wrong. No action was clear enough for you to react. And precisely because of that, you turn suspicion inward first. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Am I making a big deal out of nothing? You blame yourself, while your body is still holding on to a very real signal. Betrayal through body language is not loud. It does not strike you like a direct accusation. It arrives as a subtle misalignment between words and presence. The mouth says the right thing, but the body is not there. The gaze does not linger. The shoulders tense slightly. The breath becomes shallower. An invisible distance stretches just a little wider. And the most confusing part is this: if everything is fine, why do you feel uneasy? The emotional experience in this situation is very specific. You are not angry. You are not clearly sad. It is simply that the joy that had just sparked is extinguished almost immediately. You begin to withdraw. You speak less about what makes you happy, not because you fear others, but because you do not want to relive that vague sense of letdown again. Carl Jung wrote, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature. It is also the source of the highest good. And precisely because of that, the unconscious is not fully governed by will. When a feeling goes unacknowledged, envy, discomfort, competition, it does not disappear. It simply finds another way to surface, and the body is the most honest place for that to happen. People can control their words very well, but the body cannot lie for long. A smile can be practiced. A congratulatory phrase can be learned. But the eyes, the rhythm of breathing, the tension in the shoulders, the direction the body turns, these are all places where the unconscious leaks out. Jung described this as the way what has not been made conscious still demands the right to exist. What matters here is not that you learn to read every gesture like a detective. The issue lies in what remains inside you after the interaction. Do you feel uplifted? Or do you feel the need to adjust your joy to make it appropriate? A healthy relationship allows you to be fully happy, even if the other person is not in the same rhythm. A relationship with hidden hostility is different. It does not forbid your happiness, but it makes you feel guilty for it. Imagine a very familiar situation. You tell someone close to you that you have just been recognized at work. They listen, nod, smile, but their eyes do not light up. There is no follow-up question, no curiosity, no real presence. After a few seconds, they change the subject. You sit there wondering, did I talk too much? But deep down, part of you knows. What shifted the atmosphere was not you, but what you had just achieved. Or another situation, even more subtle. You walk into the room with good energy. The other person greets you, but their body closes off. Arms crossed over the chest. Feet angled toward the door. Their voice flatter than usual. Nothing is overtly wrong. But their entire presence says, they are here, out of politeness, not connection. Have you ever left a meeting like that and felt tired for no clear reason? No argument, no surface-level tension, yet you feel like you need time to recharge. That is a very clear sign that you have just adjusted yourself to accommodate emotional dishonesty. Carl Jung emphasized, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When you do not trust the signals from your body, you begin to trust rationalizations instead. You label unease as imagination. You dismiss misalignment as something small. And gradually, you allow unhealthy interactions to shape how you perceive yourself. One important clarification must be made here. Betrayal through body language does not mean the other person is a bad person. Many people are not aware that they are sending mixed signals. They are also struggling with their own shadow, but their lack of awareness does not make your experience any less real. The crucial question is not, are they doing it on purpose? But, how do I feel when I am with them? Do you feel like yourself? Do you feel safe, being happy? Or do you constantly adjust your emotions to keep the peace? Do you trust words? Or do you trust the sensations in your body? This is a question many people avoid, because trusting the body means accepting an uncomfortable truth. Not all close relationships genuinely support you from within. The solution here is not accusation, nor is it interrogating every glance or gesture. That only pushes everything into defensiveness. Instead, begin by trusting your intuition. Intuition is not guesswork. It is the result of hundreds of small signals your body has received before your mind has had time to analyze them. You do not need to say, I know you're jealous. You only need to ask yourself, do I want to share more with this person? If the answer is no, respect that. Save important moments for those who are truly present, not just with words, but with their entire being. Something subtle but important happens when you begin to trust your feelings. You need less external validation. You no longer have to read other people's reactions to decide whether you deserve your joy. Joy returns to its rightful place, belonging to you. Carl Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Becoming yourself is not only about living by your values, but also about staying with the most honest signals within you. Your body does not react randomly. It is a compass, and a compass does not argue. It simply points. If you are recognizing this sign in a close relationship, pause for a moment and ask yourself, are you trying to keep the peace, or are you slowly losing your emotional safety? Are you trusting words, or are you ignoring a very real feeling? Because in the end, you do not need to prove that you are right. You only need to live in spaces where your body can relax, rather than tense itself to play the right role. And that is not selfish. That is self-respect. The body is the most honest compass. When you learn to listen to it, you no longer need to ask so many why questions. You only need to know, here, can I be myself? And if the answer is no, then leaving even quietly is a very deep form of honesty. Sign 8. You begin to shrink yourself. Carl Jung once warned that the greatest danger in relationships does not lie in conflict, but in the moment when a person begins to live away from their true self in order to preserve connection. Not arguments, not breakups, not words that wound you directly, but a very quiet, very subtle moment when you start adjusting yourself to fit a relationship, even though no one ever asked you to. At first, this change is hard to notice. You do not call it shrinking yourself. You simply think you are being more considerate, more tactful, not wanting to cause trouble. You choose silence in a few conversations. You skip over stories you once felt excited to share. You smile it off instead of responding. You begin to think very carefully before talking about the things that make you happy, because you are no longer sure the other person truly wants to hear them. And gradually, you get used to it. What makes this sign dangerous is not the outward behavior, but the inner feeling. You no longer feel natural being yourself. You move more cautiously, as if your full presence is a burden to others. You start telling yourself, better to say less to keep the peace. Don't make a big deal out of it. Harmony matters more, but every time you say better not, a very small part of you is pushed back into the shadows. The emotional state of someone in this position is often deeply conflicted. On one hand, you still see yourself as kind, considerate, someone who thinks of others. On the other hand, you begin to feel tired without knowing why. Not tired from arguing, but tired from constantly censoring yourself. Every interaction becomes a silent calculation. What to say, what not to say, how much is safe to share. And then, at some point, you suddenly realize that you can no longer remember the last time you felt fully comfortable being yourself in this relationship. Carl Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. When someone cannot face their own shadow envy, inferiority, resentment, they unconsciously try to push those feelings onto someone else. And if you are sensitive, empathetic, you can easily become a container for emotions they refuse to look at. This is the mechanism of identification with projection. You are not only affected by the other person's unspoken discomfort, you also unconsciously carry it for them. You make yourself smaller so they do not have to face their sense of lack when they are around you. You dim your light so they do not have to look into their own darkness. What is heartbreaking is this: you do not do it because they force you to. You do it because you want to keep the relationship. Try looking back at the small changes in yourself. Do you still talk about your dreams naturally, or have you started keeping them to yourself, afraid of being seen as unrealistic, showy, or out of touch? Do you still share simple joys? Or do you only tell stories that feel safe, neutral, unlikely to make anyone uncomfortable? Some people once told me, "I'm not sad because they didn't support me. I'm sad because I stopped supporting myself when I was around them." That sentence cuts deep, because shrinking yourself does not happen in one moment. It happens through countless times. You choose silence over honesty. Here is a very ordinary example. You have a new plan, a direction that excites you. In the past, you would have told the person closest to you right away. Now, you hesitate. You remember previous times when you shared something that went beyond their current reality, and the response was silence, a subject change, or a comment like, "That's fine." But it might be exhausting. You do not want to feel that quiet letdown again. So you choose silence, not because you no longer have dreams, but because you do not want to make anyone uncomfortable. And slowly, you learn how to live smaller, Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Yet in many relationships, what is terrifying is not rejection by others, but the gradual loss of self-acceptance. You trade wholeness for connection, and you call it maturity, when in truth, it is a very subtle form of self-betrayal. The important question here is not, do they hate me, but am I still myself when I am with them? Are you living, or are you avoiding trouble? Are you present, or are you quietly disappearing piece by piece to keep the relationship calm? Many people are afraid to face this question because the answer may lead to changes that are not easy. But Jung emphasized that becoming whole always involves reclaiming the parts that were left behind. You cannot live in alignment with your true self if you are constantly shrinking to fit someone else's insecurity. This does not mean you must cut off every relationship that makes you uncomfortable. Not everyone who triggers your self-contraction is a bad person. Many people around you are also trapped in their own shadows. But their struggle does not mean you must sacrifice your vitality to stay. The solution lies in returning to boundaries. Boundaries are not walls. Boundaries are where you clearly distinguish what is yours and what belongs to someone else. You do not need to explain endlessly. You do not need to justify your right to be yourself. You simply start with very small steps, allowing yourself to speak one honest thought, allowing yourself to feel full joy in moments that deserve it, allowing yourself not to dim your light, just to keep the peace. Observe how others respond when you stop making yourself smaller. Someone capable of healthy connection will adjust, or at least respect it. Someone living in quiet hostility will feel more uncomfortable, more distant, or will try to pull you back into the old, easier version of you. That reaction alone will tell you a great deal without any confrontation at all. Carl Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Realizing that you have been shrinking yourself in a relationship is not failure. It is an awakening. You begin to see the shadow, not only in others, but also in your own need for acceptance. Remember this. Wholeness does not require you to become smaller. It requires honesty with yourself. Honest that some relationships make you shrink. Honest that some connections can only exist if you do not live from your true self. And honest that you deserve spaces where you do not need permission to be who you are. You do not need to hate anyone. You do not need to expose anyone. Sometimes, maturity simply means stopping the habit of dimming your own light. Choosing to stay with people who are not threatened by your brightness. Choosing to leave quietly, if necessary, places that require you to trade aliveness for harmony. If you recognize yourself in this sign, remember something important. You did not shrink because you lack value, but because you have grown used to prioritizing other people's feelings over your own truth. Seeing that is the first step back. Back to boundaries. Back to your inner voice. Back to a self that does not need to become smaller to belong. This is not loss. It is the path that leads you back to the wholeness you set aside long ago. If you recognize yourself somewhere in this sign, take a moment to ask, in which relationship did you begin to shrink? And when did it start? If you feel ready, leave a comment below. You do not need to tell the whole story, one line is enough. Naming your experience is sometimes already the first step toward healing. And if you read a comment that makes you feel, "I'm not alone," reply to it. Sometimes, real connection begins with a very small but honest sentence. We often believe that closeness equals safety, that the closer we are, the easier it becomes for people to be honest, to love, to support one another. But the journey you have just taken reveals a harder truth to swallow. Sometimes, the closest relationships are where the shadow operates most quietly, not through open conflict, but through silence, comparison, control, and unspoken wounds. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Perhaps the people who leave you feeling confused, exhausted, or forced to shrink yourself are not inherently bad. They may simply be people who have not yet dared to face their own shadow and unconsciously allow it to spill onto you. You do not need to expose anyone. Nor do you need to turn yourself into someone hard or cold. Sometimes, maturity is simply knowing when to withdraw your presence from places where you can no longer be yourself, and to preserve your energy for relationships that truly nourish you. Your intuition does not need evidence to exist. If it tells you, "This place is no longer safe," trust it. End quote. This place. This. If you have recognized yourself in these signs, remember this. You are not weak. You are awakening. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming videos on Carl Jung's psychology, relationships, and the journey back to the self. Tap the notification bell to be updated the moment we release new content. We always have in-depth, relatable, and practical analyses waiting for you to explore. Thank you for listening all the way to the end, and I'll see you again in the next videos.